it's in the breaking we come unbound. And it's in the giving we are found. Yeah, you could barely change.
Welcome to A Medicinal Mind, Wisdom and Well-Being, a podcast dedicated to the telling of authentic stories and the sharing of insightful wisdom, exploring science and spirituality, medicine and Mother Nature. No topic is off limits when it comes to growing our personal understanding and supporting our collective well-being. With your host, Dr. Rob Abbott, a family medicine resident practicing spiritually focused and evolutionarily informed functional medicine, we hope to nourish your being so that you can flourish in whatever the moment has called for you to do.
And I know you tried.
In episode 49 of A Medicinal Mind, Wisdom and Well-Being, I share space with one of the leading voices in the integrative oncology movement, a pioneer in collaborative and whole-person care, Dr. Nasha Winters. Many of you listening to the show have likely heard of Nasha or her work, but for those new to her name, here is all you really need to know. She's arguably the most widely spoken and passionate clinician I have ever met when it comes to integrative oncology and simply to whole-person care. She's the founder of Optimal Terrain, an innovative healing venture striving to educate, empower, and assist individuals in knowing their bodies and their physiologic processes from a perspective grounded in scientific research and clinical patient care. And, above all else, it addresses the root causes of cancer and cancer progression. While we certainly could have spent the entire show talking about Nasha's multifaceted approach to cancer, getting into the weeds of the ketogenic diet and nutrition, as well as supplements and complementing therapies to chemotherapeutics, much of today's show is spent in an entirely different realm. A realm science, on its own, will never fully be able to explain. Starting with a dive into Nasha's personal life story, we get a glimpse at the real reasons behind her pursuit of a career in medicine, a vulnerable look at her own journey with cancer, and what she learned along the way that is informing her career now as an oncology physician. Digging deeper, Nasha answers such questions as, what was the most challenging thing about being a patient? What are some of the best qualities of the most admirable physicians? And when precisely did she know she was going to survive? Delving into the roots of her faith, Nasha shares her perspective on the role of spirituality, religion, and the pursuit of something greater as one traverses the diagnosis and treatment of cancer. Even providing her own definition of this terrifying word, Nasha shows us precisely how she enters into the therapeutic space with patients and their families, uncovering the real reasons and questions her patients are seeking to answer. Sharing stories from her clinical experience, the depth and poignancy of this podcast is second to none, and left me wondering on more than one occasion, why do we even bother with the science and medicines when we have human connection and spirituality? This conversation was an absolute blast, and a refreshing dive into spirituality and our connections to something greater. Perhaps the real reasons healing is ever possible in the first place. And with that, let's dig into the show. Well, Nasha, thank you so much for joining me today on this podcast. You know, I've heard you on so many conversations, and we met just last year, and I was a little reluctant to even reach out knowing you've done so many of these, but finally pulled the trigger, and I'm actually so happy I did. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. I tell you, we were talking before you started the recording. I just really was drawn to you when I first met you. You are definitely a healing soul, and it's an honor to be here with you and your guests today.
Oh, you're so kind. We've shared a lot of things, off the air of this podcast, back and forth, and I too share that same just connecting touch with you when we first met at AHS. Your passion just it goes everywhere. People are drawn to you for many reasons, but you are such a passionate soul, and not to mention a wonderful clinician and author, as we'll probably talk a little bit about today. I am so thankful for that moment to get to meet you, and I'm grateful for those kind words. In putting together these questions, as I sort of alluded to, I thought it was going to be a bit of a challenge, knowing you've done so many of these conversations and you've probably had every question, in whatever form it could be asked of you. So I figured I would at least steal a little bit of what I find to be my favorite sort of introduction into these conversations from Krista Tippett of her podcast On Being, where she kind of opens up and starts with the spiritual background of her guest. And so I wanted to give you the opportunity to kind of share a little bit about perhaps your spiritual or religious background of your childhood, and maybe even contrast that a little bit with your first sort of introduction and background into science.
Oh, I love that. And you were concerned about finding new questions for me, and I think you've really nailed it. So that being said, I love this topic where you start, because where I grew up I grew up in Wichita, Kansas, spent summers in small towns, Kansas, kind of farming communities. And so spirituality was very much part of my upbringing. I mean, you were kind of odd if you didn't go to church, right? If you didn't have a spiritual community around you. And so my family was Methodist, and I was really raised in that environment. However, when I was 11, my parents got divorced, and my mom got a little disgruntled with the church community, or lack thereof of community, when she was going through this process. It was very frowned upon at the time, which, gosh, it seems like everybody gets divorced now. But at the time when I was a kid this would have been in the very early 80s, it was not normal in the community I grew up in. But interestingly enough, we were incredibly, incredibly poor. And my mom had to work multiple jobs just to keep a roof over our head. And one of the strategies that my mom used to make sure my brother and I had a square meal at least once a week was basically to farm us out to various churches on Sundays. So,
wow, no joke.
And we would be invited by many well-meaning, loving souls to invite us to their church on certain Sundays. And my mom knew we'd at least get a good meal and some good, spiritual sort of education, if you will. And as odd as that sounds, it was awesome, Rob. It was this moment where I got to see a glimpse into every spiritual path you can imagine, from Methodist to Presbyterian to Catholic to Jewish to Judaism to Nazarene to Amish to I'm just trying to think of some of the new life church communities. So I literally got a little smorgasbord sampling of it all. From about age 11 to age 14, I spent almost every Sunday in a different church organization. And then my mom really wanted my brother and I to find what resonated with us and to, continue on. And so I became hungry for just learning about other people's spiritual paths. And ironically, a few years down the road, especially after my own healthcare crises, I was able to spend some time abroad and even see more spiritual paths: Buddhism, Hinduism, Farsi. I was trying to think of what else, the dervishes in Turkey. I mean, I saw a lot of different religions growing up and was part of a lot of these environments. So what I think was the take home for me is that as a scientist today, raised in a very rich, cultural, diverse, spiritual background, but rooted in a very, Christian foundation, I was able to really appreciate the beauty that each sought, in one another. and the commonality versus the differences. And that, I think, has really informed who I am as a human being, as well as my ability to be with people in many different belief systems and walks of life, and even in places where they are absolutely conflicted and disconnected from spirit. In some ways, I can really be with people who are in that space, because when our patients get very, very sick, they feel quite abandoned. Not that different than my mom felt in the moment of her life crisis. She felt very abandoned by her spirituality, by God, by her church. Funny, at 71, she'll be 71 next month, she is far more spiritual and more, in some ways, religious than she even was growing up, because she had her own journey through it. And so I really appreciate the weird angle in which I was thrown into my spiritual path, but it has really informed the way I guess I see the world around me and the way I participate in it.
Wow, that is such a unique experience. And I've talked with some of my friends about how I would love to do something, similar with my eventual children, is basically give them that perspective of cultural diversity and spiritual diversity, and to not just go to the same church or the same mosque, or the same, be stuck in the same setting with the same people and be almost told, whether it's inferred, that, this is the only way, or this is what you should believe. And I just feel like we would be so much more accepting, as you said, kind of seeing a unifying worldview where we don't strive towards discovering differences, but really look to see the commonality behind the human experience. And I think we would become much more accepting, more tolerant, and just open-minded to see that commonality if, as children, we had a more diverse experience within those cultural backgrounds and spiritual traditions. And, it's something that I do. I try to, put into my life. I'm very involved in the youth ministry in my church, and while that is still one sort of institution, one setting, I really, really, working with these elementary age kids, don't want to come across as a preacher or strictly a teacher. I want to sort of offer them a space to kind of think about their own, faith and perspective. And some of the things these 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders say blows my mind, the insights that come from them. But how can I hold a space for them to explore and kind of come to know what is this God in their life, or what do they see as the mystery, or whatever word you want to put on it, but let them come to see that. And because ultimately I see that's going to make a more authentic and grounded human being who's going to be more accepting, not someone who simply says, well, you should believe in this and you should do this, and then kind of be told it turns into school again, and all these rules. And I'm like, that's the last thing I want Sunday to be. And so it just makes so much sense that you were, to me anyway, to have that background and to see, well, what's the most natural profession to get into? Well, let me go into something where I want to reach understanding between this individual, get into that vulnerable space and come to understand what is behind their experience. And I have so many new questions that kind of came up from your answer. Perhaps we'll get into as we explore a little bit more about your role as a clinician. But before we jump ahead into that, I at least want to sort of maybe go forward from that childhood and that foundation that you just described, and perhaps kind of in what you've described in your mother's experience, perhaps lead that into a discussion or perhaps where you saw your faith truly emerge. So while that might have been the foundation and sort of the building blocks, where did you really see your faith emerge, or perhaps where was it challenged after this beginning?
That's so interesting. Well, it's funny because, of course, friendships, relationships, like new young loves, like you kind of morph into your circle. And so I can remember, in that age, especially coming of age into my early teens and prior to college, it was sort of like I was trying on different identities or different belief systems for size, because I think that's where we are at that age, right? We're trying to see what resonates with us. And luckily for me, I was given some really beautiful exposures and some really beautiful teachers. And I can't even think of a single negative experience, even in some environments that might have flipped out a few other people. I think about an environment that I went to that was really unique for some people, an environment where people were speaking in tongues. And I was in another environment that was very, very traditional Vietnamese Buddhism, because I had a very large Vietnamese community in my town of where I grew up. And places that in the middle of the plains of Kansas, I literally saw the spectrum of what was available and did not have, interesting, I got lucky where some of my colleagues and family members have been met with some judgments or some closed doors or some barriers. I don't know if it's because I went in so willingly and in a place of surrender and absolute heartfelt curiosity, but I was met with absolute divinity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And love and openness. And I was hungry to learn and understand, even if it didn't, seem like something I was interested in. So I felt like each time was a further opening of my being. And for me, however, where it kind of where it really hit the wall of, okay, how much do you believe in something far bigger than yourself, was when I was faced with my own mortality. And so at 19 years old, to be told you have a few months to live, and being very angry at the world that could happen to anybody, and being really angry at what I perceived to be all the causes and reasons why I was met with that, mortality, was a disconnect from God and spirit. And yet the more I pushed that back, the more it flooded me to realize that I was, I had nothing to fear, that I had an absolute trust that as hard as it gets, as scary as it gets, that I was held, that I was supported. Each time I wanted to fight against it, it almost flooded me more with this, I guess, for lack of a better word, grace, this understanding. And it's carried me for, my gosh, it'll be 27 years beyond that point, where I have just not had a place of fear with regards to my own mortality, my own trajectory, my choices that I've made in the studies I've done in learning about medicine. In fact, I took the same approach to learning about medicine that I took to learning about spirituality and religions.
I had a hunch I was going to go there, and you already went there. Yeah.
Well, it fits into the story beautifully. I mean, after my diagnosis, I was working at that time in a mental health and detox, addiction center in my town in Colorado, and the area in which I lived at that time, and still today actually live back in this area, was on 4 Indian reservations. And so here it is, I'd already explored quite a bit growing up in spirituality, religions, etc. But suddenly I'm in an area where it's like a whole nother world. And the healing and even the spirituality were tied up into very ancient tribal, beliefs. And I was able to witness and be part of certain ceremonies and certain ancient rituals that also just kind of broke me wide open to realizing there is so much more out there in the world that we're exposed to. And so it sent me on a launch of exploring Native American healing modalities, Ayurvedic healing modalities, Chinese medicine, the Huichol medicine, the curanderas down in Mexico, the Greek medicines, the old herbalists, the eclectic herbalists of Europe, the homeopaths of Europe and India. I literally trained with, studied with, interned with, even sought care from a variety of these healing modalities, along with conventional interventions, testing, laboratory analysis, diagnostic imaging, you name it. And so what wove my psychology around spirituality was the same exact approach I took with learning medicine and applying that to my patients and myself, frankly.
Wow, it is so beautiful seeing that, just the weaving. I already started to have a thought as you were describing this, and you went there without me even really having to prompt you, was seeing just the connection between that spiritual journey and then sort of leading you naturally and this exploration of healing traditions. And I am completely with you in terms of wanting to expand our view. I think that's what a lot of people in the ancestral health space, people can boil it down to say, oh, you're studying cavemen. Well, that's just a joke. I mean, to think it's that, myopic. really what we're trying to understand is these different cultural traditions and how they approached not the disease process, but the healing process, and through the power of ritual. I mean, that is so profound that you describe those experiences. I think, the podcast just before this one, I was talking with my good friend, Dr. Will Vandiver, and he had that same experience, like just the incredible power of this ritual and how he could use that. And I think we get a little bit of it with like kind of the placebo and the ritual perhaps behind the placebo, and how we can engage our own inner healing through seemingly nothing, but this engagement in the power of ritual, and it blew his doors open, just as it sounds like that power kind of opened your eyes to really see what is truly possible, and not to like close a door of traditional medicine, or not close the door of sort of Western scientific, inquiry. I think there can be this beautiful meshing, and it like hurts me when I start to see people sort of get stuck in these camps. And yes, it takes more energy, I think, to kind of weave those stories together. So it's easier to kind of get stuck in one or the other and kind of play, put my hand in the sand or head in the sand and not really pay attention. I'm so grateful that you continue to take that energy and time to try to weave those stories. I guess, for people who've probably listened to many of your conversations, you've already talked a little bit, you alluded to some of your personal journey. I don't want to spend and force you to spend any more time there than you would like to, but would love if you wanted to at least kind of share with people, perhaps one, if not already, what was one of the major insights or the most challenging thing you found while you were a patient sort of undergoing that process? Because it sounded like you got over the kind of mortality thing pretty quickly. And I seem to think as a physician, that's probably, I assume that's usually the most challenging, but it sounds like you kind of got through that fairly quickly. So I wasn't sure if there was something else there that kind of really, stuck you in the mud.
That is so funny. To me, that was weird, and that again, that I'm not a normal creature probably, but I remember like the mortality Band-Aid was ripped off pretty much from the get-go, because when you're given such a limited possibility of what can happen, your priorities change pretty quickly. And so I think that was weirdly my biggest changing, was being told what my expiration date was, right? For some people, at least in my experience since then, it empowers us. It wakes us up. It's like the fire, to the kindling that just says, activate, do something different, move, right? That was my path. And for others, it may be very much a paralysis, a deer in headlight, an overwhelm, a complete passive process. Not to say that either are right or wrong. They just happen to be kind of different, I suppose, personality traits that invoked that response. And before I go into that a bit more, another moment that happened actually years later into my process. In fact, it happened in 2004 and my diagnosis was in 91. So this gives you perspective that even 13, years down the road, I had a huge epiphany or a huge awareness when my brother-in-law died of pancreatic cancer. Now, that sounds tragic, except for if you knew my brother-in-law, Bob. Bob was diagnosed 24 years prior to that with stage 4 inoperable pancreatic cancer. All right.
Wow.
So let that sink in.
Yeah.
Just right there shows you how unique he was. The other aspect of my brother-in-law is Western medicine didn't offer him anything. And he also went on a journey that took him down actually to Mexico. He spent some time in some Mexican clinics that kind of put him on the right path. He lived for 24 more years with the tumor intact at the head of his pancreas. They had unfortunately done a botched Whipple procedure. And so really the next 24 years, he was dealing more with GI issues versus cancering issues, but his cancer stayed put. In that time, he watched his boys grow up that he never thought he'd see grow up. He was also given a matter of months. He ended up later meeting and marrying the love of his life. His work as a soil scientist ended up in the Smithsonian. Brilliant scientist, brilliant. Most of the things happening in the Northwest today is thanks to his work. And so when he died, I always sort of saw Bob as a bigger than life person and had some of the most amazing spiritual and emotional connections with him. And when he died and they held mass for him, because he was raised, my husband and his family are very, very Catholic. My husband's a baby of 10. Bob was the eldest of 10. So they were the bookend. And when Bob died, the priest got up and basically said to the congregation that my brother-in-law had gone to hell because he was a scientist. And it brings a lot of emotion just thinking about that. And I was floored, because if this man had actually been in the presence of my brother-in-law, been around him, Bob convened with God more directly than probably any human being I've ever met. And he did so in the most reverent way within all of God's creation, out in nature, and studying, being in awe of nature, and contributing his wisdom and his, frankly, conversations with God in a scientific method into an institution that basically was the perfect merging of science and spirituality that I have ever seen. And I was so taken back. And my husband, bless him, he stood up and he spoke a very different truth about who my brother-in-law actually was. And luckily, everyone there knew this truth. And I was so taken back that one person had a belief system and a judgment that science and spirituality could never merge, could never be one. And it was Bob who taught me very much that shortly after my diagnosis, he became an incredible teacher and mentor and got me out into nature in some really out of the way places and in beauty. And to me, that became my church in many ways, Rob. That was the place where I feel closest to the power of healing and closest to the power of spirituality in nature as was created. And so I just felt like that was an important kind of an aha, that it kind of came to me later in life to realize it's almost like that priest gave me a moment in time to absolutely deepen my faith, deepen my connection to, frankly, spirituality and science in a way that I didn't realize was disconnected until he kind of pointed it out. And it has also then since, my gosh, how many years? 13, 14 years later, I can't separate them from one another. I can't even imagine them separated from one another.
Yeah, it's fascinating. That's a wonderful story, by the way, and so well articulated. I was kind of brought into your family just by you describing so vividly like that conversation. And it's fascinating because I think, where that sort of the question and that experience, I see in my own life that my biggest struggle and biggest challenge when, I was sick, and then even now sort of as I continue as a clinician, is bridging those two worlds, and are seeming that they need to be, having the eyes that they are two worlds, when, like you just said, they really are one. It's a further unification. How can you bridge these two worlds? Because ultimately that, to me, is the most powerful healing. The most powerful clinician is someone who can see the unification of science and spirituality and hold that space with their patients. And I think what you alluded to earlier was that, in your mother, the thing that I see very commonly, and it sounds like you saw it in your family, was that people can, even of extremely strong faith, when faced with a tremendous health challenge, can either go one of two ways. It can be strengthened even more, and they can find further foundation of their faith to motivate them to perhaps make changes, try therapies, give them strength through treatment, or they can see that as, why God? Why me? Why now? And completely be fragmented and feel, alienated, or feel that they're being, this is, they're kind of their punishment. And so sometimes, I see having to navigate that space and enter into the room. You can't just suddenly pray with everybody, because maybe that person just suddenly decided that God's not a big part of their life because he's the one behind their diagnosis. And just seeing, like, in front of your eyes, the separation of this person's faith and potentially their path to finding peace, whether they heal completely or use that as a transition to the next life, that's what, won't be giving that glue that what maybe their foundation is completely taken out from under them in the face of this. And how can you, as a clinician, it's not just for chaplains or spiritual advisors, in my opinion, how can you help them see and blend where they can use their faith to then be empowered to see how the science or the medicine or our therapies can help them? It was a little bit of a ramble, but I just thought, like, in seeing how I've seen it come out in my patients and see it that you describe it in your mom. I was curious, as we get maybe into more of your sort of role as a clinician and in sort of the integrative oncology space, how have you seen that play out in your personal experience, and how do maybe you go about helping to bridge those two worlds and divides for your patients and perhaps even fellow clinicians?
Oh, such a good question. I suppose to me, the way that I feel like I can connect with someone that I'm working with is just to frankly be present and to listen. And so much as our skills as a clinician today, that is kind of, for the most part, even naturopaths and integrative providers do not get as much time as we would like with a lot of our clients. But when given the space, even if it's sitting next to somebody on an airplane, or waiting in line at the post office, if you just sort of hold an intention that you are absolutely listening, with your whole body and being, people start to unravel, unfold, share, open up in some pretty significant ways. And I find that in holding that space and allowing that, people come to their own conclusions without me pushing it or imposing it on them, if you will. Now, I do sometimes, when it feels intuitive, when it feels appropriate, might share a little bit of some of my experiences, either personally or with another patient that might have a similar story or a similar dynamic that seems appropriate to share, because the ancient traditions of healing wisdom also came down through storytelling. Just like you and I talked about at the beginning of before we started recording, that part of the format that you want to use is the storytelling. That is how we connected, and how language and how communication and writing and later healing all came to be, was from simply sharing of one's story. And so I have often said to colleagues and to patients, I'm not your doctor. I'm a collector of your story, of your sacred story. And I, hold it very near and dear to my heart. And I learn something from each person's story that then helps me learn how to be with somebody else's story. It just goes on and on. It's unlimited where this has gone. And so I don't know if that completely answers your question, but to me, that's one of the places of just kind of giving somebody room to share their story can be incredibly powerful to their healing, and me even show them a new way of seeing their circumstances, because they know it's within us, right? We know the answer to our questions if we just simply are given the ability to take a moment and look at them and share them and explore them.
I always sort of say, I know someone more famous has already said this, and I don't know who it is, but we are our greatest problems and our greatest solutions. We sort of have that inner innate wisdom, and where it comes out is probably when we sit in community and share stories, and the enlightenment and insight that can come from simply listening to someone or kind of sharing in that environment is quite profound. I've had some of the greatest insights for what I feel can guide people, and sometimes I'll hear it as a patient. They may not completely know it as they're kind of sharing it, but once you really get deep into their story and you've built that trust, you suddenly hear something come up and you're like, oh my goodness, like this is where we need to push forward. This is where the healing can occur. And I mean, that's my opinion of the future clinician, is someone who is, yes, very much steeped in this incredible scientific background, but also recognizes the limitations, is not afraid to go into those vulnerable spaces. And to be honest, that's where I see the power of the feminine. And I think, science or medicine has been too paternalistic and too sort of dominated by the masculine perspective. And I really see, and it's not about, gender. We use these terms because we've created this divide. Once again, I think we're going to a place where unification will happen, and there'll no longer be masculine and feminine. They're just going to be humanity. But take some of these more feminine values of that sort of intuition and that natural sort of like compassionate healer, and bring that to to medicine. I think that's going to be those types of healers who are able to integrate that with some of the rigorous science as we continue just into this incredible technological advance. I mean, that's, to me, it brings me hope rather than despair when, sometimes it can seem a little daunting when we see the amount of chronic disease that's out there. With that in mind, you work with so many different clinicians. I'm sure you've probably seen people across the whole spectrum having tons of science and no spirituality, or all spirituality, no science, and somewhere in between. I would love for you to maybe offer people a little glimpse into what you are doing now as a clinician in this space, trying to help people weave that story. And people are probably waiting, like, man, we've gotten 30 minutes in this podcast, and there's like no science. Is this person, what are they going to talk about? Maybe you can humor them or humor me, and perhaps lead us into a little discussion about what it is from where you bring in the science into the spiritual journey in your work.
Sure. And, I think that, even though we splashed around a lot and more the esoteric and the spiritual in the beginning, that at least gives you an idea of what informed how I see and practice in the world today. So that way of the way I basically assess a patient, if you will, is I like to take kind of that bird's eye view. I love to collect as much data as possible, whether it's tangible from like a blood test, right, or a diagnostic imaging, whether it's subjective from maybe them sharing a chronological life event, experience with me, whether it's a 3 to 2 week diet diary, whether it's their epigenetic SNPs, whether it is a tissue assay or a blood biopsy. That information, that data, is all put together in sort of this and churned sort of through me of 25, 27 years of clinical experience, both personally and professionally, in a multitude of environments, as you are now well aware, that then allows me to see certain patterns and trends in a way that I think is pretty unique in the world. And so, those posters, Rob, that people look at that are just a bunch of squiggly lines, maybe colorful squiggly lines, but if you sort of cross your eyes just a little bit and let your soften and look at it, suddenly there's a dolphin jumping out at you, or a bird flying by. Like, you see things differently if you just take it all in and soften your gaze, instead of the way we do kind of in our culture today, which is sort of, overly, black and white it, and get very linear and very, like you said earlier, a little bit patriarchal, a little bit intense, a little bit yang with that approach. So if you soften it and take a deeper look, you often see trends and patterns that you might not have noticed before. And so I use the mantra in my practice: test, assess, address. And so here's so funny. We talk about being pretty spiritual in the beginning of this conversation, but I've also been accused of being overly scientific and overly test happy. But I know myself, and I know the types of clients that are drawn to my services, that data is compelling. It gives you a point on a map, helps you know where you've come from, helps you know where you are, and helps you know where you need to go. And that data has changed the outcome of my patients from being a pretty dreary statistic, in the big picture, to having some hope and having some direction and having some clarity, and frankly, not being the statistic, to be an outlier of the conventional statistics given their circumstances. And so that is how I kind of take it. I do that, weave together bird's eye view of as much information as possible. And in fact, in the perfect healthcare world, and where I think medicine will go, we've given a lot of lip service to the concept of precision medicine, to the precision medicine initiative that was launched by the White House in 2016 by Joe Biden, was this idea that we can go into genomic study and immunological therapies, to really change outcomes, in particular with cancer, for patients in the future. Great idea on paper, but we're still running it through the same filter and the same model as before. And so there are a lot of people out there running these tests today, but no one knows what to do with the data. Yeah. Well, I know what to do with the data. I've watched that data. I've applied that data to myself and thousands of others, that I feel hopeful that we literally are on the cusp of something incredible, that we will take people to health care, not disease reduction, and to wellness versus disease management in a way that we never have before. And maybe it's a little, I don't know, a little bit Pollyannish of me, but I really do have hope that the tools that are coming out in conventional medical and the brilliance of biotechnologies and HRV technologies and how we can kind of biohack ourselves in some really unique ways, blended with these sort of ancient vitalistic medicines, is incredibly powerful of truly, again, that blend of the best of ancient wisdom with modern science.
Weaving from story to story, this conversation unfolds more as a spiritual revelation than a recitation of scientific facts and wisdom. Having met Nasha just a year prior, it was numbingly beautiful to hear the authenticity and depth to her stories, all the while feeling that boisterous and energetic presence I had come to adore some months prior. It became quite clear as the conversation continued that despite the intricacies of her scientific approach and her absolute love for quantification and resolute analysis, Nasha's faith in the unexplainable and seemingly unimaginable was actually the foundation behind her approach to healing, her gateway into the patient's world that made overcoming a diagnosis like cancer something more than a fairy tale. Amen. I mean, I'm right there with you, with everything you just said. I could just start clapping now. No, that is exactly. I share the same vision, and I say sometimes it seems a little utopic, but I'm just that kind of optimistic, and have that sort of open mind and agree. We need to sort of blend the power of these two worlds. I mean, it's amazing to think now with some of the immunotherapy that's being developed. And I see just broadly like the immune modulation, the therapies that involve, immune modulating components or creating further immune flexibility. Like that's really the future. And whether that is with an herb or with reprogramming your own T cells. I mean, there's like a whole spectrum of things that are out there, but there's incredible power when we see the power of those kind of therapies, and I see that being the future. And so I'm grateful that you sort of kind of there brought in, sort of wove in that story, that spiritual background to really inform kind of where you get into the science and where I think we are as a country really driven by big data, or the data are needing something to inform our decisions. Because I agree, I think I'm the same way. I would like to have some of these new tests and data that are out there, and we're just trying to kind of sift through it and see what can we make of these things. What patterns emerge. I mean, I think that's the hardest thing amidst all this data, is to see the bigger patterns. Because if you just look black and white, a lot of times nothing's there, right? When you just look at the lab scale, nothing showed up red, if you look at it black and white. But if you look for these patterns, which are maybe a little more embedded, you might see things, and it's a little more nuanced, and that takes time and openness. You use the term in that answer, and perhaps now is the best time. I'm just kind of curious what your answer was. This is really a selfish question, but really curious. We've been using this a little bit throughout the conversation, but been using the term cancer. And I will say, if there's any word out there that will put greater fear, trepidation in an individual, a patient, or perhaps an individual who's now becoming a patient, I find that there's no such word, no equivalent for creating that potential fear and trepidation. And so wanted to at least get your kind of, maybe it's going to be medical, maybe it's not going to be very medical at all, but what would be your definition of cancer?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, I've lived it within myself and with thousands of others over many years. So it's sort of taken a couple of turns as far as how I would define it in a given decade, basically since starting this process. But here are a couple kind of bullet points about cancer that I could offer. One of my colleagues, she's a naturopathic oncologist, Tina Kazor, really well known in the field as well. She defines cancer, and I love this, as basically a cellular sociopath. Okay, that it's got like zero regard and zero remorse for the fact that it's going to take out its host eventually, and that it just sort of goes along creating destruction in its path without any, poops given, just for lack of a better word. So there's that concept, but that seems a little, to me, not quite enough. And I know like just who she is as a person, that's not it, but I love that she kind of coined that phrase. So it seems a little fatalistic. And how I also understand cancer to be is it is an evolutionary process, an evolutionary wound healing process. So what that implies is that it was meant to bring something good to the table. But somewhere along the way, it got shorted. Its messages got shorted out. Okay. And so the ultimate sort of description of cancer to me today is the absolute disconnect. Okay. Think about that on a bigger level, literal, physical, spiritual, energetic, you name it. We are more connected than ever in social media and technologies today, and yet we are the loneliest and more isolated probably than ever in history.
Yeah.
And so I almost look at the gifts and the curse of technologies very similar to the gifts and the curse of cancer. And so what it is it's an opportunity to see where it's disconnected, rewire it, reconnect it, reestablish a proper communication. In fact, in many of my clients, probably a better communication than was ever even there first. It's like, talk about an upgrade. It's like an entire new system, put into the computer, if you will. And so that is sort of the esoteric kind of description. And then, of course, what we're really learning, where the research is going, is into the metabolic aspect. And simply speaking, this comes down to how our body uses energy to drive the physical body down the road. Okay. And we have an opportunity to know where that energy is being usurped, where the energy is coming from, where there's a breakdown in the energy creation and distribution, and how we can come in and correct that. And so that you can kind of see these like 4 bullet points it's almost like an evolution in the past nearly 3 decades of how the research has gone in the field of oncology to begin with. Because when we talked about that sociopath, it kind of seems like you're just a sitting duck and you're kind of screwed no matter what. That's still the somatic theory of cancer, that you're just simply a bag of bad luck genes and it's just a matter of Russian roulette. I don't think that is true at all. And I believe that we are learning a more hopeful, process, that there's a lot we didn't understand. There's a lot we still don't understand, but we're somewhere in between, that we're starting to create more of a dialogue with it. And we're starting to get new information, new insights, and we're starting to learn how to kind of rewire the system. And at the very least, increase quality and quantity of life in regards to all chronic illness, not just cancer. And maybe aren't necessarily seeking, quote unquote, the cure, because cancer will always be in us. We all have those cells, but we certainly can keep them, at bay. We can certainly keep them in a level of synergistic or symbiotic relationship within our body that's not causing us harm, and thank them for the messages they've told us of how disconnected we become and driving us to becoming more whole, more connected, more metabolically active.
Wow. That's another beautiful, once again, just like illustration. I've heard you talk a lot, and I've never, even in this ancestral health space, kind of seen that story of seeing that kind of as an evolutionary disconnect, or that's sort of the mismatch hypothesis and some of those theories, but seeing it as a sort of disconnect. And I love how, too, you make that point about, and this is something I tell my patients often, is, I have cancerous cells, you have cancerous cells. It perhaps hasn't gotten to a point where it's created a tumor that's impaired physiologic functioning or created some other process that's disrupting an organ or till we finally see it and we see the immune system have some kind of abnormal response. But we all have these sort of cells, and I love how you describe it as kind of more information, just as I see symptoms as kind of information of that disconnect, and can lead us down a road to what do we need to fix, to what's the root cause behind it. And I think you illustrate a huge point of a huge area of emerging research is perhaps, the origin of a cancerous cell is not simply some somatic genetic mutation. And I think we're in this great big search, and the reality is it's a complex issue, and I want to get your thoughts on this in a second. Yes, it's a complex issue, but perhaps the, cancerous growth and dysfunction that we see from, cancerous overgrowth comes from an issue with metabolism before any issue with, say, gene replication or cell replication. And I think that's a fairly new and novel idea that you've been promoting and exploring and using as a main pillar of your therapy, is seeing, well, actually, is the metabolic dysfunction underlying the issue more so than the genetics? Is that, does the dysregulated metabolism actually lead to problems with cell growth and cell replication? And do we really need to target that before anything else? So I'd love for you to maybe explore that a little bit further for us and perhaps paint that. And I remember this beautiful picture you showed about all of the components that are playing into this complicated, and it's something you've woven into the name of your company, this sort of terrain hypothesis. But we'd love for you to maybe kind of weave in this story of how metabolism is playing a role in what you just call this sort of energy disconnect, how that's playing a role, but also how it kind of interconnects with this even bigger story, and how cancer is really driving as this sort of destructive process.
Absolutely. And, when you talk about that metabolic process, to get down to the fundamental machinery behind that comes down to these little organelles that are within our cells called the mitochondria. Okay. And if you had a biology class in junior high or high school, with the mighty mitochondria, which is the factory where ATP, which is our energy source, is made. So what we are now really starting to understand, as you so beautifully pointed out, is that instead of saying the gene caused the disease, we need to back it up a few notches to the mitochondria getting weaker, getting less efficient, having less in number. Okay. And that is what leads to some sort of vulnerable DNA damage, genetic damage, that then plays out into a variety of chronic illnesses, including cancer. And so one interesting thing and this is just, there's a lot of things we've learned in the last, 10, 20 years around this. But one piece that really stands out to me is that your mitochondria, those little powerhouses, they make your energy, but they are also in charge of something called apoptosis. Cellular, programmed cell death. So basically, in all of us, we have a garbage collection system. And when we are functioning efficiently and effectively, our body is taking in nourishment, it's processing it, it's taking it and breaking it down and taking it into the cells to nourish our biochemical pathways that are frankly keeping us alive. And then it breaks down any debris and any sort of foreign invaders in the body and gobbles it up and takes it out of the body in a variety of ways: sweat, urine, feces, saliva, breath. It takes it out of the body in those ways. So what we're now understanding in medicine, or where a lot of the research and a lot of the energy is going, and frankly where vitalistic medicine is coming back kind of into the center stage along with its conventional cohorts, is that when our mitochondria are weak or not working properly, we sort of get confused. Our body holds on to the garbage and lets go of the nourishment. So when I talk about cancer being that confused, disconnected process, think about it. That is the ultimate, oops, I'm holding on to the poop, but I'm letting go of the goodness. That is what starts to happen. And so people like you and I, we can come basically in and start to retrain the physiology, and we can start to explore what's inside that mitochondrial bucket. And just to give you some examples of what might contribute to the health or disease of that bucket are things such as your epigenetics, so things that were passed down from previous generations that you have control over, that you can actually change the expression of. Or perhaps your microbiome, which, oh my gosh, just a few years ago, everyone ignored the utility of the microbiome, and now it's all the rage in research. And in fact, we recognize that it probably plays a larger role in disease and wellness than we ever thought, especially in mind-body aspects, so depression, definitely our immune system, and even other communications and circuitry within the body, but also things like toxicant exposure, so metals and pesticides and benzenes and all the crazy things that we have added to our world since World War II. Sugar metabolism going from 5 pounds of sugar per person per year to over 175 pounds of sugar per person per year within a 150-year window is enough to clog up the gas tank for all of us. And then things like hormones, immune function, inflammation, blood circulation, circadian rhythm, stress response. Those are the types of things that go into our mitochondrial bucket at any given moment. And so it's up to us to look inside the bucket, see what's there, take out what shouldn't be there, reorganize and reappropriate what is there, and give it the building blocks that it needs if it's lacking of anything. That's pretty simplistic, but man almighty, that I believe is the future of medicine as well, because we now understand that cancer is just on the continuum of things like neurological disease. That includes autism spectrum, that includes Alzheimer's. It also includes things like cardiovascular illness, chronic fatigue syndrome, a whole array of autoimmunity, which I know is one of your specialties, and of course, things like diabetes, metabolic disorders. So it is all from the same bucket that we are getting increasingly sicker because we keep adding more things that shouldn't be in the bucket into the bucket.
Yeah. I love the bucket analogy. I know I use it so much, and it's so true. And I don't think that yes, it's a simplification, but I don't think for the purpose of this conversation, it really gets down to actually our therapies are much simpler than our core therapies anyway need to be much simpler than we're making them out to be. We need to, I've said this before in other podcasts, exhaust the lifestyle components of our therapies, because that's the major thing that's being put into the bucket. Yes, are some people coming in on many different drugs and other things that are kind of additional substances? Yes, they are. But the reality is so much of what is driving this process, and it is that bucket, is coming from our lifestyle. And I love how you talk about peering into there and seeing what needs to stay in the bucket or what needs to be taken out, maybe temporarily, put back in, or what needs to be completely removed and never go back in there. And we have many tools at our disposal to try to create a environment and terrain for healing. That's why I've loved your approach is, I'm not so focused on any one area. How can I give the body the tools it needs and create an environment where cancer just can't grow, can't exist? It can't. You've eliminated the ability for this disconnect to exist. And so I've really resonated with that approach. And I know for myself, I've kind of created this 3-prong realization that really what I want for my patients and for them to heal is create this metabolic flexibility. I want them to be able to switch in between different metabolic fuel sources, because that is a sign of healthy functioning mitochondria. On the other hand, I want them to have immune flexibility. So when you get exposed with a virus, I want you to be able to respond to that and have an appropriate immune response. Or exposed with say a food particle gets into the bloodstream. Whatever it is, you need immune flexibility so you don't get stuck in one area and become predisposed to an infection or developing cancer or an autoimmune process. And then the last piece is building resilience of the human spirit, of that human organism. That's the sort of like psychospiritual aspect. And somewhere in there is the trinity for healing for me. And I'm making it obviously overcomplicated, but how can we create this immune flexibility so we can switch out of a cancerous phenotype or an autoimmune phenotype? Where do we need to modify the diet and perhaps exercise or movement patterns to create more metabolic flexibility? And then how do we give the individual purpose and meaning so that they can create that resilient organism, that resilient and connected human being, so that they can bring all of this into purpose and reality? And I don't know, it's really where I'm kind of directing my ship, and it sounds like that's what your work is, and what I've seen your work become. And was curious if you wanted to share, kind of delving in perhaps a little bit more into the bucket. I don't want to get into the super duper details because we're a little bit short on time, and perhaps it'll be for another conversation. But maybe perhaps you can illustrate for us, maybe even in a real life story, going back to our storytelling, a story of how you connected with a patient and started to peer into that bucket, and what was the process like to perhaps navigate through that with them?
Perfect. Well, I have a really good example recently of a woman who was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, a non-small cell lung carcinoma, adenocarcinoma form of a non-smoking woman. Okay, so didn't come from, the dreaded cigarette exposures. And in digging deeper, she's done a load of conventional therapies and quote unquote failed those therapies. I really despise when that's placed that way, but that's how Western medicine categorizes. So she's had multiple approaches, including clinical trials and including failed immune therapy trials, which had they started with an immune therapy with her, they may have been more successful, but unfortunately they eradicated so much of her immune system, just as you talked about, Dr. Robin. There was like no immune flexibility. So it's like it just landed flat on the system and in fact provoked a pretty aggressive autoimmune response that almost put her into end organ failure. So I was sort of the last resort, which unfortunately is still the case in the majority of the folks that I consult with today. I should be the first resort, but life is what it is. And hopefully in another 20 years, that won't be the case. But ultimately, when we started digging, we found a few things. Like she's an avid golfer. She lives on the golf course. She's out there 3-4 times a week. She also is an avid swimmer. These are toxicants in her bucket that she's exposed to day in, day out, and has not, and has had 7 decades of that adding into the bucket. And so we simply started taking out those exposures. She's passionate about swimming and she's passionate about golfing. So we just helped her sort of, how does she clean up her body and prepare her body to go and be part of those lifestyle activities that are pretty toxic. And we did some testing to find out that sure enough, she was dealing with a lot of glyphosate poisoning, which was coming from her golf course, as well as a lot of chlorinated fluorocarbon, and chlorines and bromines and things that were disrupting her endocrine system from all the chlorine in the pools. So we got her on kind of a routine of saunaing and prepping her body with some things to help take out the garbage, some supplements and whatnot to help that. But the biggest piece, and this just gives me chills, that was in my other training in Chinese medicine, we look at patterns of organ systems. So wherever a disease process is manifesting, that often tells us a story in and of itself. And so in her history, there was nothing signifying what I relate in Chinese medicine to the lung organ, which is grief and loss. Okay. And so in asking this woman more details about just telling her the story simply of saying, this is associated with a grief and loss pattern. Does that resonate with you? Is there anything in your life where there might have been perceived grief or loss? And she had her family with her in this consultation, and everyone kind of froze. And at first I thought maybe my screen froze, because it was such a visceral, like there was just this unbelievable moment. And suddenly it is just like we've pulled the scab off. And she'd lost a child about 11 years before and had never even talked about it. Couldn't talk.
Yeah.
No one in the family could talk about it. Just even the living the father and the living daughter and the sort of surrounding family and friends that were in the circle, this had never been addressed. And the amazing thing is the day we had our consultation, she'd also connected with an acupuncturist who was working on her lung meridian in her lung cancer. And this woman that she was drawn to see had also lost a child. And the two of them,
goodness.
I know, right? And the two of them found each other. And this woman who was like bedridden and unable to get up and move about and talk and eat, it was like something shifted. I watched it happen in an instant on our conversation that it was time for her to finally reconnect the part that had to be disconnected entirely because it was too painful to bear. And now she could come at it differently with someone who was there physically on the ground, who'd been through it, that could support her through this process. And yes, did we need to bring in nutritional support? And yes, do we need to bring in other supportive therapies and even conventional standard of care interventions? But the shift in her healing, the trajectory of a woman that was actively dying when I got on, the consult with her, it changed literally in that hour. And I have since been had follow-ups with her, and this woman is no longer dying. In fact, I would say she's probably living for the first time in 11 years.
Wow. I got chills just listening to that, and the palpable just shift that occurred in seeing that energetically, whatever approach you want to take. I mean, that's amazing. I mean, these things that I say, you can't make these things up. Like, you just can't, make up the details of these stories because they're so raw, they're so real, so authentic. And that's exactly what that woman needed. And she found the people that could help illuminate that in her life and then, take it on. And it's beautiful to see, because I mean, there's no way, maybe just generalizing, but there's no way without that shift that anyone's going to be willing to make the nutritional approaches or be willing to explore the supplemental protocols or be willing to even engage in perhaps some of the conventional therapies without that significant shift. I see it all the time, or people only doing it because a family member wants them to do it. They're driven by some other source that's not really them, and until there's a why behind anything, none of those therapies, whether they're conventional, unconventional, anywhere in between, really matter. And so that's so profound to see. For you, that was where everything began. It didn't really start with these are the things that are going to get you well. You recognize there was something here that needed to be at a core addressed, and it's so beautiful to see.
Yeah, and everyone. I mean, oh my gosh, thousands of stories like that. It's not, that wasn't a unique day in the office. That's the day to day of what I have the absolute privilege of being witness to. And it just further intensifies my desire to learn more, to apply it more to myself, to apply it more to others, and to keep that connection going, and to branch it out into a global perspective. I mean, I have lofty goals. I truly believe we can heal the whole planet, the whole population, if given enough resources and support to do so, and connections to do so. That's where we can use our technologies and our social media for good and can truly connect us. And so I am, like I said, I'm hopeful for that, but it takes one moment like that at a time.
For everyone, listening, I encourage you to seek out some of the other podcasts that Nasha has done. They really delve into the nitty-gritty of perhaps what this individual in this case went on and perhaps pursued or did. And I know you did a great one with Guillermo Ruiz, one of my good friends. And I loved, I texted you a few months ago when I heard you come up on big follower of Brian Johnson and his Optimize group. I'm like a lifelong member, and I saw he personally had this huge shift in his life for his family. And he started talking about where he dives into the books, and metabolic approach to cancer came up, and I heard, and I was like, oh my gosh, I need to text and reach back out to Nasha, because it was just, he's such an important person and motivator in my life, and to see this, once again, the interweaving stories of how him sharing that it's going to affect so many people. So he's got some great free or great content about cancer that's driven by pure passion and pure exploration. So Brian Johnson, Optimize Me, you will find Nasha's stuff embedded in there. There's so many other things that maybe you can help people. I'll give you the opportunity here to point people to perhaps interested in really the nitty-gritty science, where to go. But I've just been blown away by this conversation, the depth of it and where we've gone, and kind of weaving that into some of the other stories that I've heard, and people listening have probably heard about your work. And I've been left kind of wordless. So thank you.
Well, it takes two to tango, my friend. So I am so honored. You are your thoughtful questions and your presence of being present is also very powerful to drive these conversations. And I can only imagine how it plays out in your clinical practice as well.
Yeah. Well, I was a little sad, I will say. Here's such kind words. I was a little sad at the beginning of this conversation. I was planning to see you, and depending on when this comes out, at the Ancestral Health Symposium. But it sounds like you are just the amazing superwoman doing 1,000 things, and actually aren't going to be there. But wanted you to at least provide for people here. What are you going to be doing over the next few months? Because it sounds like you're doing some incredible work.
Oh, there's so many fun ones coming up. So I'm actually on Tuesday, or actually Monday, I leave for Europe, and I have 4 back-to-back talks in a row in the UK, and in London, and then in Glasgow, and to talk about a variety of events. I'm speaking at an international consortium of naturopathic medicine. There will be like over 500-600 naturopathic doctors from around the world. Talk about bringing in an eclectic mix of people, because trainings in naturopathy are very unique also around the world as well. So I love being in that group. I'll be presenting there on longevity, which of course will come back to the mitochondria. And then I fly over. Oh, then that night I have also before then I'm speaking at a group called Rude Health. Nick Barnard's group, basically like the ancestral movement of the UK. Yeah. This group is having, I think, Zoe Holcomb, she's really well known in this environment. So I'm having dinner and doing kind of a presentation for a lot of doctors who are into the ancestral health movement. So that'll just be more of a fun, social but educational forum. I'm also then presenting at a low-dose naltrexone conference on mistletoe and how it interweaves with other immunomodulating therapies like low-dose naltrexone and beyond. And that is in a university setting with very scientific, one of like white guys and then crazy, me into the mix of this.
There you go.
Speaking at an amazing, a patient-driven, it's called the True Fields Cancer Festival, of a young woman who overcame the statistics of a stage 4 terminal diagnosis, and basically wanted to create a place of celebration, but also of education and inspiration. And so it's sort of like the Oregon Health Fair meets ASCO. And so
that's a good description.
And so I have the pleasure of being there speaking with some other colleagues of mine that practice integrative oncology around the world, which I'm very excited to be part of. But then I fly back and I'll be teaching at the National Medical Student Association for Naturopathic Medicine and the American Association of Naturopathic Medical Doctors. I'll be speaking to that group on metabolic approaches to cancer. One I'm hoping I'll see you at, Rob, is the Low Carb USA gathering, which is in San Diego at the end of July, very much in the same kind of vein of ancestral health. I'm actually presenting on circadian rhythm biology, which I'm very fascinated by. So I'll be presenting there on that. I'll also be presenting on that at Acres Conference this year, which is crazy, which is a permaculture biodynamic, like farming community. And the majority of their followers are Amish, which is amazing. I told my husband, I'm like, I'm kind of a big deal among the Amish. So,
I was going to say, and it started in your childhood.
I love it because I had no idea till I came to this conference, because it's a group that reads voraciously. And I was interviewed in the Acres magazine last September in preparation for me speaking there last December at their annual conference. And when I came to the talk, I had no idea what I was walking into. I expected maybe 30, 40 people at my talk. Being almost 700 people, and probably 2/3 of the audience were Amish. And I was blown away because I've spoken at hundreds of conferences, both for the general public as well as medical institutions and integrative therapy, centers. This group got it more than anybody I've ever worked with. It was so humbling. I literally cried 3 times during my talk. I feel kind of embarrassed by that now, but they understood. I was speaking on soil, the inner soil, and how it reflects to the outer soil. So the soil of what we're growing our food and our livestock and our world in, but also our inner soil, going back to our microbiome. So this group has actually invited me back to do a 1-day workshop as well as another presentation. And this year I'm going to be talking on circadian biology. And then I'm also presenting at Weston Price Foundation this year at a big IBC symposium at the Society of Integrative Oncology. So it's a very eclectic year ahead. And I get super inspired by this because that just tells me that everyone is ready to come to the table together and talk about how we can think about this and do this differently. And so to me, I'm pretty on fire. As much as I'm super busy, I'm really looking forward to the eclectic audience that I get to share with and learn from.
Wow. I feel super honored now to have gotten this time with you. If you listening oh my goodness, this woman is unreal, and your passion to go share this message, share this word, and to hear other people's stories. It's so profound, and I couldn't agree more with that eclectic group that you're going to be connecting with. That is just unreal. Thank you for pursuing that work, and please keep taking care of yourself along that journey. If I found anything in my early medical career, my capacity to help somebody is directly correlated to how much time and space and energy I put into myself. And so please keep caring deeply for yourself, because you have so much great work and so much love to share with people. That's just on paper, a bulleted list, a small subset of the passion and work that you're doing. So, Nasha, wow. I think before you finally go, though, you have to at least mention to people the book that I feel like everyone's been reading this past year, and really getting into the nitty-gritty science. Please share with people that book and how they can get it.
Sure. So the book I co-authored with my colleague, Jess Kelly, who did a lot of cancer retreats with me and worked in my clinic for a period of time, and brilliant writer, brilliant colleague, brilliant nutritionist, therapeutic nutritionist. And we wrote the book, The Metabolic Approach to Cancer. She kind of took my 20-some years and made it organized and helped me get the message out there. We have a Facebook page, Metabolic Approach to Cancer, that you can follow what we're up to. And I try to add a lot of good current information that keeps validating the information that's in the book. Or even altering it if we learned something new. I want it. It's a dynamic process. I was hard pressed to write a book because almost the second it came out, there were already about 100 pages more information I wanted to add
stuff.
to it.
Yeah.
Right. It's just, there's so much new information. And then I also have a new company that I started in November with my colleague, Dr. Christina Compton. It's Terrain 10, the number 10. So Terrain 10, the number 10.com. And this is where we really are about redoing the medical healthcare system via things like research, education, data collection, and optimization, and how we are starting to make some really powerful inroads with, like I talked about, bringing everybody to the table. That is the goal. The patient, the researcher, the clinician, the integrative provider, you name it. There is a place for all of us to co-create. And so that's what that kind of organization is all about. And then I do have a book coming out with Christina as well in the fall of this year on mistletoe. It's 17 authors from around the world sharing their passion and understanding of the 100-year-old mistletoe therapy, the oldest integrative oncology therapy known, on the planet today. And so there's that. And then Jess and I are currently working on a therapeutic cookbook specific to things like, how to eat during chemotherapy, how to, intermittent fast around chemo, how to eat with radiation, how to deal with cachexia, those types of patterns that are really, really tough in the field of oncology nutrition. We really want to lay out some guidance for both patients and practitioners. So busy year, but a lot of amazing things coming together thanks to, frankly, people like you and listeners that you have that are demanding more information, more hopeful and new information.
If you aren't inspired by all the things that Nasha has shared today, I don't know what else can spark a fire. It's incredible what you're doing. And yeah, I think we feed each other the passion. And I love seeing the work that people do in different areas that are very new to me, and just adding to that, bigger bucket of knowledge and that we can expand. And I, right there with you, how can we really help heal so many people who are in need and healing, or show them the tools for themselves to heal? It's truly possible when we have this kind of perspective. So, Nasha, thank you so much. I hope our paths cross somewhere in the near future. I know my schedule is extremely restricted, and you probably have like your schedule planned for the next 2 years. But I'm sure they're going to cross at least at some point in the near future. So thank you for spending this time with me, at least today.
Thank you so much, Rob. What truly an honor, and what a blessing you are to so many. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. So I reciprocate and send all of that back to you. So thank you.
Thank you for your presence and willingness to receive a new narrative, a passionate perspective, and perhaps a deeper sense of connection with our collective purpose. Please share this podcast with any and all that you believe will benefit from its intention to relieve one's doing and engage one's being. Please share your comments about the conversation on our podcast page and leave a review in iTunes so that the voices in this space can spread to all ears ready to receive it. Music credit goes to Dillingham for their song Vessel. Remain open, stay curious, and forever be love.
You walked on fire, and I know you tried.